Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Kefauver. Y'all, I have been waiting to invite my friend Steph onto the show, so I can't believe I get to say these words. Steph, welcome to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast.
Oh, well, hello, Lisa. Hello, friends. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Yes. So glad that you're here. You all are in for the treat. You heard at the top of the show a little bit about Steph's journey and to writing this book, Soulbroken, a guidebook for your journey through ambiguous grief. If you're checking out a clip, you can see, like per usual, mine is covered in sticky notes and underlines, etc. And we're going to dive deep into that, all the wisdom, so much wisdom that you brought to us around ambiguous grief and ambiguous loss. You know the drill. I'm going to drop the link to get the book in the show notes, whether it's for yourself or if you have a friend going through any of the activating events, which we're going to talk about what that means for ambiguous grief. You can consider that an act of generous grief support by getting that person a copy of her book. So anyhow, welcome to the show. And I want to dive in where I have had the privilege now over these past 5 seasons of asking my guests to help us all unpack our grief beliefs, right? How did we come to believe both, the helpful and the unhelpful ideas and beliefs that we have about grief? And I like to do that by asking people to share a story of an early memory of loss and how the adults in your life were modeling grief. What did that look like? What comes to mind when I invite you to think about an early loss and kind of what you started to learn about what grief should or shouldn't be or feel?
Yeah, gosh. Well, thanks. Thank you for that beautiful invitation. My first memory of grief came around the death of my grandfather
Mm.
when I was 12. And it was my mother's father. And she has a number of brothers and sisters, so a large extended family on that side. And when he died, which was quite suddenly and unexpectedly. He wasn't sick, and he was relatively young. He was 70 at the time, and in good health, by all assessments. Um, what was what I learned from that experience was the power of love and support that families and friends, provide to one another.
Mm.
My mom, my dad, my parents, they spoke openly about it. They grieved publicly. I remember my dad standing up and saying a few words about my grandfather, his father-in-law, um, and uh, and yet, um, as I grew older and experienced more loss, um, and came to understand that different people do it differently, right? Um, I I gosh, it was a heavy learning curve when it came for me in middle age,
Yeah, yeah,
and it wasn't what I expected it to be.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I appreciate so much about what you just offered there. Often listeners know, folks come on and say, my parents didn't talk about it at all. We never talked about the person. They didn't show emotions. And so what I appreciate about your story is there's the both and, which we all know is sort of
Hmm.
my favorite phrase, trying to have us recognize that that's actually how we live our lives. There's the both of they were talked about them and they showed emotion and shared stories, and the different kinds of losses which result in grief, another mission, I think, collective mission of ours, right? Which is not just death
Yeah.
loss. When different losses come, we can respond differently, in parts because we haven't been given permission to recognize it as loss, but also because we're at a different place in our life. We have a different relationship with the thing or the person or the place or the
Hmm.
dream that we lost. And so we can't reasonably expect ourselves to be equipped or be prepared or even respond in the same way. And that's not even to say the idea that different people have different grief styles. So forget just you grieving differently in each chapter of your life, right? You and somebody else grieving the same loss, it might look really different. So I just appreciate the richness of your story
Yes.
of offering us the, I had this experience, and then when it came knocking, I was really not prepared. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you're so right. And I think it is such a rich experience because, what we see as children, especially,
Yeah.
helps to inform our worldview. And not until we're, kind of consciously observing others at whatever age, you know, are we, at least for me, what that's when I was able to notice the discrepancies. And a kind of a nuance to your point is that not only do other people, not only do we all grieve it differently, but we grieve differently
Yes.
individually based on who or what we're grieving, right?
Exactly.
And so grief is just this dynamic, ever changing part of us that can look so unrelatable in one instance and then absolutely relatable to somebody else in another, right? Because
Yes.
it's because of course it's the equal and opposite extension of love, right?
Yeah.
So um if
Yeah.
there's where there's great love, there's great grief. And so somebody who has a much stronger relationship with their grandfather or their dog or their career or whatever it is they've lost than I have,
Yes.
we it might look very different. But on
Yeah.
some things it might be very similar.
Yeah.
It's
No, it's
sneaky. It's sneaky, isn't it?
it's a sneaky bitch. But
Just
part
it changes shape and form.
it does. I to that point, I want to just remind folks, especially folks who are maybe new to the show, listening to this new, or have heard about my book, which is the same title, is yes, grief is a sneaky bitch. And I think there's something inherently, there might be some inherent sneakiness to grief, but part of why I do the show, part of why I wrote this book, my book, part of why I love your book and all the guests who come on my show who've taken a stab at really telling a broader story about grief is I think grief is sneaky because of the cultural problem that we have
Yes.
by trying to pack grief away under the myth of our individualism, that it's something to get through, all of the myths that we've debunked over the years on the show. And so I still stand by Grief as a Sneaky Bitch as a title, in part because it gets people's attention and it's cheeky. But part of what I'm really trying to do is make, and I think you are, all the people
Mm-hmm.
that I collaborate with are trying to make it less sneaky, because that's where I think a lot of the suffering comes from, because we expect it to be or feel or for ourselves to behave a certain way because of the very little information we've been given about it. Yeah, but
You're
really,
right. Yes.
it's inherent to all of us. 100% of us are going to go through it. I was saying before we started hitting record, I'm listening to the beautiful Francis Weller's course, Apprenticeship of Sorrow, and he said this phrase that just really has been like reverberating in my being for the last few weeks, which is grief is a core human faculty. And
Amen. Yes.
amen, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
period, end of sentence, exclamation point. And the reason we are all so detached from it is because of this sort of cultural problematic individualistic
That's it.
world, like modernity, really, in a way that we've lived. So I love
Perfect.
that we are having this conversation today. And in particular, in your book, Soulbroken, you really get at, grief sort of writ large is not talked about, or talked about incompletely and inconclusively with a very thin, story. But the kinds of losses that result in what we call collectively ambiguous grief or ambiguous loss is
Mm-hmm.
even less talked about, less acknowledged, less permission giving. So I can't wait to share with listeners sort of the unfolding of what you offer us in the book around what constitutes the kinds of losses
Mm-hmm.
that result in ambiguous grief, themes around forgiveness and ritual and regeneration. But I wondered if you just share again, to the degree that you want to share, what brought you to wanting to write a book about ambiguous grief? Like, what was the story there? And yeah, just help us sort of set the stage for what you learned along the way, and then how you offered that as a gift to us through this book.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Well, much like you, Lisa, I kind of stumbled into the grief space after a life-changing event that it really shook me. And this now was 7 years ago. I discovered quite accidentally or divinely, I've come to believe that my marriage wasn't what I had believed it to be. And, for some people, they laughingly joke and say, oh, lucky, they're waiting for that golden ticket to get out of a marriage they don't want to be in. For me, that was not my experience. This was a 20-year relationship, 3 children, a partnership I absolutely loved and was proud of. And it was devastating. There's really just no better word. It was disorienting. It was confusing. Um, and it's one thing to, we understand that we don't know our future.
Right.
We don't know what's happening for us later today or tomorrow or next year if we get there. And we know that, we understand that. And yet to not know your past, to realize that you don't know the truth of your lived reality, is a different kind of mind bend. And if anybody has had this experience of betrayal trauma or the discovery of a secret that's just, informed you that the life you expected, that you assumed you were living, that you understood you were living, in fact, you weren't, they'll understand that. And so, I went through a period of just incredible sorrow, anguish, depression, all of it, really trying to make sense, to understand.
Yeah.
And it, I kind of laugh at myself thinking about it now. I tried to intellectualize my way out of it, right? I mean, which
This
you
is why
can't do.
this is why we're
Yeah.
friends, because this is, yeah. I mean,
Right.
I've been trying. I keep having to set that one down because I keep trying to pick up in my
Uh,
intellectual capacity as like a tool, and then
Let me see if I can figure this out.
let me see if I
Right. And
can. Yeah.
yes. And
Nope.
so, no. And for me, having the grandparent reference that I, just
Yeah.
shared with you as my reference for grief, and the other grandparents that had died, in between that time and the time of my discovery, those were my most profound grief experiences, as well as a beloved aunt. And so what I understood though was that my grief this time, it felt different.
Yeah.
There was something missing. And I just honestly, I was in bed for 6 months. I mean, that's hard for me to say because it's true. And I feel sad for that time in my life, for me, for a lot of people. And during that time, kind of after I came out of that, I started to really try to process it intellectually and understand, why is my grief different? Long story short, I have a I have a master's in public policy. So
Yeah.
that certainly does not relate to grief work at all, right? I'm guiding people through grief now. I've written a grief book. But for me, I used those skills that I had learned to put together a survey
Yeah.
and put it out online, and the data from that survey was helpful because it helped me see that so many people were experiencing what I was experiencing, but they didn't have a name for it.
Yeah.
And for me, the closest thing I could find at the time, and again, this is 7 years ago, was the work that
Pauline
Dr.
Boss.
Pauline
Yeah.
Boss had done back in the 90s. She was a clinician and she was observing her patients come in. For whatever reason, she was seeing patients whose loved ones were missing in action.
Yeah.
And so she had been kidnapped or were missing. And so her work, though robust and just uh, good work,
Yeah. Yeah.
was close but not quite to what I was experiencing, because it wasn't my loss that was ambiguous, right? And a lot of her early work talked about, natural disasters was another one where you don't know if they have died
Yeah.
or not. And so it's like this perpetual holding
Yeah.
vigil space.
Yeah.
And for me, I knew that wasn't the case. There was no question about um, aliveness or death. It was my grief that was ambiguous, not my loss.
Yeah.
And so that was really the impetus in trying to to get some data to see if I could connect the dots. I had some hunches, I had a hypothesis, but seeing it was really, really helpful and helped me crystallize it, because what wasn't happening for me that I expected to happen based on my own
Yeah.
early grief origins, right? Was what I saw, how I saw people caring for my grandmothers, right? With visits and casseroles and listening to people eulogize and talk about love and share, come together in community and share stories.
Yeah.
But when you're going through the loss of where your grief is ambiguous, we don't have those societal norms to
Yeah.
engage.
Yeah.
And something, an early thought that I had, like in my grief brain stupor, was, where are my casseroles? Why am I not getting a cat? Really, like it
Yeah.
was just, it felt like, shouldn't my refrigerator, my freezer be filled?
Yeah.
And it wasn't. Now, mind you, it took me 3 months to share with friends and family um, that I was divorcing.
Mm.
And there's, certainly reason for that too, I discovered later. But at any rate, that is what got me started on this path of really just trying to understand why my grief was different, and then finding a community of people, from my survey or from articles that I had written and were, posted on various outlets, saying, oh my goodness, me too. And I haven't told anybody, or I talked to so few people about it.
Yeah.
And how do you heal? Well,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
another
that's,
loaded, that's another
yeah,
loaded word, right?
it is another loaded word. Yeah. And
But
we're going to
until you
dive into that.
learn,
Yeah.
yeah, until you learn, it's just perpetual sneak attacks, right?
Yes.
Where until you get to really know grief. And I suspect there's still some, like, you know, I, I know that I don't know everything. I know there's more to
None of
learn.
us do, by the way.
And I learn
Yeah.
from each other, and I learn from your
Yeah.
story and from the stories of others. And I think the more we can share that, the more
Yeah.
grief literate we'll be as a society.
Yeah. Yes. Hallelujah. Oh, so many things that you unpack there, but I want to make sure that we get into sort of how, and you said so many people when they read your article said, yeah, me too. And I can already imagine
Mm-hmm.
there are listeners who are listening to this episode already who are already saying, me too, me too. I had this ambiguity. I want to name,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to dive into like, what are the activating events? What are the common activating
Mm-hmm.
events that kind of lead into this kind of ambiguous grief? I want to dive into the notions of internal and external hope as a
Mm.
resource, and thinking about what is the nature of those things, forgiveness if we have time to, and even regeneration. I want to name too, the other way in which Pauline Boss later in her work, and I think we collectively in the grief space have thought about grief. There's the MIA situation, right, where someone's missing, where they're physically present but still in our hearts because we're
Mm-hmm.
not sure what has happened to them. And then there's the ambiguous grief that many people experience when someone is physically present but like psychologically distant. So if you have someone in your life who has Alzheimer's or dementia or maybe
Mm-hmm.
addiction, where they're
Yep.
there but they're not there. But in that way, I think that form of ambiguous grief is more closely connected to sort of what you're talking about, right? Which is like, they're still alive, but this relationship, the relationship that we knew, the relationship we were capable of having,
Mm-hmm.
is no longer. In your case, it was because of this betrayal. And for many people, it's because of this betrayal, or if we're talking about divorce. But I think there's a broader community of people who can probably really connect with this idea that the grief feels so much more ambiguous. And again, we're not grief thieving or comparing. It's not like one is easier or harder or better or worse. They're all losses are suck. Our
Yeah.
goal
Yes.
is to have them suck less, is to move through our grief that way.
Mm-hmm.
So just wanted to name that. But for you, when you sat down to write Soulbroken and started thinking about what is it that we need to name when we think about the different kind of activating events, um, that can
Mm-hmm.
lead to this particular kind of ambiguous grief. Yeah.
Right.
What came up for you, and what did you want to share with folks?
Yeah. So the research that came back, the data that came back, really surprised me. And to your point about physical presence, but psychologically absent.
Yeah.
Absolutely, dementia Alzheimer's, any kind of cognitive decline, traumatic brain injury, for
Yeah.
example, is included. But what I didn't expect were answers that included addiction, discovery of a secret like mine, but a
Yeah.
discovery that wasn't mine exactly. Other discoveries like,
Yeah.
we're not your biological
Biological
parents, right?
parents. Yeah.
Or something of that sort. Estrangement
Yeah.
was really big. Divorce, incarceration, indoctrination. If you think about a cult or a gang,
Yeah.
um, identity change was another one.
Yeah.
And, this was, so in so many of these instances, hearing people tell their story, often for the first time,
Yeah.
really helped me to understand that, you know, what I was looking for, Lisa, was to figure out, okay, my grief is different, but how do I feel better? What can I do to feel better? So like
Yeah.
this ambiguous grief, there's some structure to this grief without a funeral or a eulogy or these
Yeah.
norms, right?
Yeah.
And what I found from the people who were responding and talking about their situations was that if shame or embarrassment is
Yeah.
internalized in any of those activating events that I just listed, and then there's certainly more, but if there's shame or embarrassment that's internalized, then what happens is that the griever, again with no societal norms to engage, they
Yeah.
often isolate and grieve alone.
Yeah.
But it does not have to be this way. And that really kind of understanding that piece about how many of us stay quiet because there's not a comfortable space to share the truth of
Yeah.
our experience. So we grieve it alone, and then what does that even look like, right?
Yeah.
That's what really inspired me to put this into a book,
Yeah.
to kind of put together the experiences that have helped me and that others have shared that have been helpful to them, really understand that this is a normal and natural response they're having to
Yeah.
love, to loss. And so often we go through so many experiences like this through our lifetime, and and again, so many I didn't name, but we have these experiences and we aren't able to understand that what we're feeling is grief.
Yeah.
And
And
what
naming is
we're
so important. Like, while
it is.
intellectualization isn't the answer, damn it, I wish it was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Naming it as loss is so profound, which can be a challenge if, as you said, there's shame and embarrassment. It can be a
mm-hmm.
challenge when it doesn't have that societally recognized, oh, there's a person who's dead. And I mean, we don't even do that well, but at least we have some kind of ceremony, or people bring casseroles for those kinds of things. But all of
Yes,
it starts with being willing at first to even name it to ourselves. This is a loss.
yes,
And
yes,
then
exactly.
to bridge that from that knowledge to the knowledge of how do I invite the people in my life who care about me to also acknowledge and see this as a loss. And part of the bridge that you talked about is moving through whatever shame or embarrassment that might be in the in between. And
Mm-hmm,
I do want to say, whether it's an ambiguous, any kind of grief, the myth that we have in our in modernity, I would say definitely in our Western culture, in general, is this myth of individualism is so problematic. No grief, as I said, grief is a core human faculty, Francis Weller said, but no grief is meant to be metabolized alone. It's everything that we're meant to experience is meant to be experienced in community. So I even think people's shame and embarrassment is further exacerbated because of this culture of individualism, right? I think that even pushes
absolutely.
us even to the brink. So yeah.
Absolutely. And you can test that by looking at, just the most obvious is, your husband died.
Yeah.
And when you endured that just absolute soul crushing grief, how long before you notified your loved ones?
Right.
Probably pretty
Immediately.
quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they weren't there for you
Yeah.
already, right? But for an ambiguous griever, for me, I didn't talk about it for 3 months because I didn't want to be talked about,
Mm. Yeah.
right? For me, there was no safe place
Yeah.
to I didn't know where were my safe places, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't talk about grief.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I was in a grief group with individuals also experiencing my a betrayal trauma did I start to view it with a different lens, right?
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Until we can come together in community, and I believe you telling your story, me telling my story, people being able to name grief and tell their story, that's how collectively we'll come out of this individualism.
Yeah. It's my continued hope that we, um, as a collective, move in that direction, right?
Yeah.
Because I do
Mm-hmm.
think that the unrecognized and unprocessed and unmetabolized grief from all the kinds of losses we experience, from the maturational phases of our lives to these ambiguous
Mm-hmm.
losses, to the losses that we traditionally think of as triggering grief, right? Death
Right.
loss.
Mm-hmm.
All of that unprocessed and unmetabolized grief is really at the root of so much of our anger, violence, suffering, and the individualism that we buy into keeps us in that loop, right? But it
Yep.
must
Yep.
just be me, so I'm going to keep it to myself, and then I don't process it, so I take it out sideways,
Yep.
cause harm, then somebody else has experienced loss, and so we go. So
Mm-hmm.
my to segueing to the topic of hope, which I thought was a really interesting way
Mm.
you broke down one of the paths, as you said, to sort of feeling better moving forward with your grief was around distinguishing and understanding the role of hope. My hope, I dare to say our hope, is that we can be pushing back against that individualism so that as we tell our stories, as we model all the good, the bad, the ugly
Mm-hmm.
of what that experience is like, we're going to reduce some of that unnecessary suffering that is happening. Yeah.
Oh, you said that so beautifully, so
Oh,
poignantly. Yes, yes, and yes to all of that. And
yeah.
hope. It's important to me that I'm not misunderstood on this
Yeah.
because I recognize that hope is a beautiful thing. It is an important part of our human experience.
Yeah.
You can find so many beautiful quotes on hope just by
Yeah.
Googling that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I always think, it's a virtue in Catholicism, and it is, as um, Emily Dickinson says, that thing with feathers perched on the soul that sings a tune all day long and never stops at all.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Hope is a beautiful thing. And I always have the vision of, Cinderella's bluebirds when I
Yeah.
read the Dickinson quote, right? Like, oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
But what I learned
And
with
we've co-opted the word hope in our culture.
We have,
Yeah.
yeah, and again, so like, hope is good. Yes, I get it. Yes, and
Yeah.
for ambiguous grievers, I believe that hope, when misdirected, can be as dangerous as it is good,
Yeah.
and hope then becomes more like a squawking Iago parrot
Yeah.
that it incessantly does not stop talking, squawking. It is not the bluebird any longer.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, and I learned this by being able to name it in myself with the help of the group of women that I was in circle with, going through this as well. And again, when you can't name it, it was on the tip of my tongue, like, there's that behavior again. Oh
Yeah.
gosh, now I'm doing that behavior that she was doing. Oh,
Yeah.
now she's doing the behavior, but I didn't know what it was. And basically, for an ambiguous griever, no matter what your activating event, um, hope presents as a part of the grieving process. And
Yeah.
it's tricky because I say hope is a double agent,
Yeah.
right? Hope feels really good, and and then hope can feel really bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's tricky to distinguish until you know what you're looking for.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that, because I love that when I got to that part of your book, of Soulbroken, around recognizing sort of the both and of hope, and
Mm-hmm.
the particular, which I think, by the way, is true for, I think your lessons work even beyond ambiguous grief, but the ways in which you started to distinguish the role of what you call external hope
Mm-hmm.
and the role of internal hope. Help us understand what they are, like
Yeah.
distinguish them, and then why do we need to know the difference? What do we need to be looking for?
Yeah, thank you for that. So external hope is hope directed toward your loved one, because again, your loved one is still living,
Yeah.
right? And so there's hope that ultimate physical death has not happened.
Yeah.
And in a physical death, we understand the finality of it to our own personal extent, right? And
Yeah.
and depending on your faith, your upbringing, you might be hoping to be reunited with your loved one in another life, and after death, whatever your beliefs may be, and that's all valid, and that can feel really good. But when you're grieving somebody to a physical death, you are not hoping that they ring your doorbell.
Yeah.
That has been removed.
Yeah.
In your intellect,
Yeah.
in your being, that that's not going to happen. But when you have lost a child to addiction and they've run away and you don't know where they are, when you've lost a best friend to estrangement, or uh, any one of the other experiences I
Dementia or
named,
also, yeah, exactly.
yes, there's hope. There's hope that a cure will be found for that cognitive decline. There's hope that they'll ring the doorbell and say, I went to treatment and I don't have the substance abuse dependency I did. I'm in recovery, and we cling to these, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't,
Yeah.
because again, hope is a beautiful thing, but we have to be careful about how we engage with that hope. So external hope is where we are focused on our loved one. And it feels really good, Lisa. It
Yeah.
feels so good because you feel proactive. And that's how you might wonder if you're in external hope or internal hope, which I'll
Yeah.
define in a minute.
Yeah.
But that external hope feels good. It says those things. It says, maybe if I just found the right treatment center.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe if I just explained myself this way. Oh, maybe if I had so and so reach out to them, that would do it. And we're
Yeah.
looking for ways to make the connection with the end result. Our intention in that is that the end result will be that they return to us, that the
Yeah.
relationship can resume, because we miss them. They're our loved one, right? No matter
Yeah.
what the activating event is. Now,
That
internal
that
hope. Oh,
before
go
you
ahead.
go on, I just wanted to offer to all of us, I think part of why, again, loss writ large, but particularly ambiguous loss feels so challenging to us is because there's this lack of agency, right? This
Mm-hmm.
lack of our own agency to affect outcome, right? And so, particularly with an ambiguous loss, external hope kind of gives us this, I don't I don't want to maybe say the word, but illusion that we have, right, agency to change or impact an outcome in that way. And that's why it feels so good because, I mean, at the neurobiological level, we don't want to feel like we are, don't have control. That can feel very scary. So external hope, and by the way, if you're recognizing, as you're saying, as we're describing this, as Steph is describing this, like, ooh, I trade in external hope a lot. Welcome to the human condition. We all
Yes.
do. So, like, no shooting
Mm-hmm.
on yourself, as I say.
Nope.
But I do think external hope, again, as you said, has its place. But I think part of why it feels so good is it gives us some connection to this notion of agency, which is
Absolutely.
what we've lost when we found out our, a secret has been
Mm-hmm.
kept, or when somebody has turned to addiction and we can't do anything about that addiction, right? That we lose that agency. And external hope is like, oh, like it's a little
Yes.
invitation to feel like you have it back. So that's external hope. We can visit there, but we don't want to hang out there, is what you're saying.
We don't, but for some of us, myself included, we're there a really long time.
Yeah.
And even when, and so I have a hope survey on my website. I'm
Yeah.
continuing to collect data on hope, and I appreciate anybody. It's anonymous. The data is just helpful to me to understand how to help others, right?
Yeah.
And what I found is in my research, when I first polled on hope, was that 94% of us have experienced ambiguous grief at least once in our lifetime, where there's
Yeah.
been a change or death of our relationship, and we are not sure how to grieve it,
Yeah.
right? And so we
Yes.
don't. And for of that 94% population, 60%, over 60%, indicated that they stay in external hope
Yeah.
more than internal hope, and they cycle in between. So
Yes.
whether your loss of this person in your life happened last week or a decade ago,
Yeah.
you may still be cycling in between. And it's, again, welcome to the human condition. It's
Yeah.
because, of course, you get a new idea. Oh, there's new research. Oh,
Yeah.
there's been
Yeah.
an advancement. So maybe they'll change their mind. Maybe,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
so we hold that hope.
But
Illusion is
external
a great
hope,
word, by the way.
illusion, because external
Hmm.
hope keeps us from being present to what is.
That's right. It's a denial mechanism, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Which so
understandably
does, by the way,
so.
rumination. I always talk about rumination is also a denial or an avoidance. It, or, right, the shame cycle that we get in, it keeps us guilt. It keeps us actually from being present to what is, and then what is possible.
Well, and
Right.
that's why you're exactly right. And that's why internal hope feels so uncomfortable because it exposes all of that,
Damn
right?
it.
And external hope, yeah, internal hope doesn't feel good at first.
Yeah.
But a lot of things don't. We have to become aware of what it is. And the more aware we are of it without judgment,
Yeah.
without attachment, just to name it. Oh, okay. I'm an internal hope. And internal hope is hope directed to yourself in the new experience of life without your loved one as they once were.
Yeah.
I am not suggesting that internal hope means that you are turning off your love for that person or you
Right.
are turning off your
Hurt,
deeply embedded
sadness,
desire.
anger,
Yes. I
pain.
mean, you can't. Of course you can't. And, you know, it's hard to, it is hard to acknowledge that for many, that you're turning into internal hope, because what that means is you're not directing your energy toward external hope.
Right.
And it can feel kind of like leaving your loved one on the side of the road, right?
Yeah. It can feel like
Abandoning
giving
them.
up. Yeah.
Right. But you're not. You're choosing to reimagine your life for yourself. And that, to your perfect point, is hard because we are in denial otherwise. We're not able to stay in the present moment and really digest, metabolize
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
it is, the reality of what it is. And
Yeah.
so internal hope looks like I am going to do something good for me. I am going to engage in something I enjoy. I'm going to try a new skill. I'm going to meet a new friend. You're investing in yourself, right?
Yeah.
You're not going back to your old haunts with your person. You're not, spending time doing research or writing letters or bids of
Creeping their social
familiarity to try to
media.
bring them
Yeah.
back in. You're not, right? And now,
Yeah.
it's 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning and you
Yeah.
find yourself on Instagram wondering, or you're doing
Yeah.
a Google search to see what might come up. It's going to happen. You can say, okay, this is external hope.
Yeah.
I'm going to get out of it. Right. And again, we cycle in and out of it, but
Which again,
hope is a double agent.
it is a double agent. I
Mm-hmm.
just love, love, love this description. This chapter had lots of sticky notes
Yeah.
and underlines in it because I think it was just so useful. Again, I think beyond
Mm-hmm.
this beyond ambiguous grief, it was just such a helpful reframe or conception. And because I love language there, my narrative therapy history, I just loved the invitation, and you used a lot of invitational language in this book
Mm-hmm.
too, which resonated for how I approach my work, which was that kind of curiosity, like, oh, I'm noticing I'm
Mm-hmm.
in external hope right now. And it's not a
Yeah.
judgment. It's not full of laden. And
Mm-mm.
we can notice that we can vacillate. Like, what might it
Yes.
mean for me to be, what might it look like to be in internal hope? What next, you
Yeah.
call it the next right thing in the
Mm-hmm.
book.
Right.
I always think about the amazing poet David White's poem, An Invitation Start Close In. Like when we feel
Oh.
overwhelmed, well, how would that look like? Like what would being an internal hope look like when I've spent all this time being
Mm.
devastated in external hope? And I love this notion of
Mm.
start close in, right? Just
Yeah.
what's
Oh, I
that
love that.
next? Or I feel like Oprah said 20, 30 years ago, what's
Mm.
like the next best thing? It's not the right thing. It's not the perfect thing. It's just the next thing. And that's how we
Yes.
keep, I would imagine, keep dipping our toe in internal hope.
Yes.
This is just, okay, what might, being curious, what might it feel or look like for me to be in internal hope? It might be
Yes. Oh,
doing something kind for myself, or yeah.
absolutely. And again, just remember it. If anybody's listening and they're thinking, okay, I'm going to try this. I'm going to be more aware and intentional with my
Yeah.
internal hope. it
Yeah.
is uncomfortable at first because what's happening is you're grieving.
Yeah.
You're in the moment. And when you're in the moment and you're reconciling the truth of your reality,
Yeah.
it's so heartbreaking. It's painful. And so, yes, it hurts, but I invite you to let it in,
Yeah.
name it, let it in, get in bed, get in the bathtub, do what you need to do
Yeah.
to
Or be with
invite
a
it in
friend,
and
you
cry
know?
it out, laugh it out. Right. Whatever it does, whatever helps you. But
Yeah.
running away from it just delays the inevitable, I
Yeah.
think.
That it not feeling good doesn't mean it's not the thing that you need. Darn it, again.
Ugh,
So annoying, this
no
way life
fair.
works, no fair. The reason I said that is, I mean, even in my book that's coming out next year, I feel like I spent a lot of time about the being, finding ways to be with your grief. But one of the things, again, I've been just drawing out even since turning in that manuscript, and as I've reading folks like you and learning from people, is part of that being with isn't just the solitary experiences. I think how we withstand the hurricane force winds of being with our grief is by holding on to others. It's kind of being in community, whether it be through ritual or just presence, or like you described, the power of you being in group with people. I do think that part of how, in part because we need people to, I mean, for that metaphor of the hurricane, we need people to sort of hold us up, but also because we aren't the first peoples who have gone through it. And for somebody else to bring their wisdom because they've planted some deep roots, right, to hold us up
Mm-hmm.
can be
Mm-hmm.
really powerful. But also
Mm.
for people to, I use this expression as I close the show. I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart. And part of what I think we do when we risk being an internal hope and be witnessed by other people is people gift us that I see you just as you are. And we
Yes.
need that so much when we're in the muck of being in that grief, as you
Yes.
said, right?
Yes. Yes. And grief needs to be witnessed. And
Yes.
whether grieving your husband to betrayal and divorce, or grieving your child to an identity change, or sibling to incarceration, whatever the case is, the love that is equal to your grief is very real. And without the societal norms to engage, how are we able to show others, yes, this is my ending to this
Yeah.
relationship,
Yeah.
but oh my gosh, does that mean we aren't able to celebrate the love and share the love? And so I encourage people to, and again, this was quite, you know, accidental. It's what I needed. It's what I needed. So I created a faux funeral, and I invite others to do the same. And I invited two people, only two people who knew my marriage best. And they were my witnesses as we met at the beautiful place. I had readings and music on my iPod. I put on a rock, and
Yeah.
a photo. And I shared stories about the marriage I loved that had died.
Mm.
And they shared stories about my marriage
What they had witnessed.
that what
Yeah.
they had witnessed. And that validation is why it helps the soul broken among us, because that, to be soul broken, I say, is to be filled with anguish brought on by the loss of our love and our relationship, and often ourselves.
Yeah.
And it is often without validation. So creating a ritual in whatever way helps you honor the love that you're grieving is transformational. I mean, it was so transformative for me. I stood up and received the two of them like I would have had
Like
there
in a
been a
line of
funeral.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
took them one at a time, yes, and I heard what they had to say, and then I thanked them back. And
Yeah.
it was so validating for me, Lisa. And as others have reached out and shared their faux funeral experience,
Yeah.
I'm so pleased that it's helpful and healing for them too. Who
Yeah.
says we can't do it, right? Just do it,
We can
whatever
do
it is for you,
we
whatever
grown
we
up. We
want.
can do whatever we want to do.
Somebody
Yeah.
made up a funeral once
Yeah.
upon a time.
Yeah.
So here's a faux funeral. Have at
I
it.
love
See
I love
see how you
that.
feel after. Yeah.
I love that faux funeral. And you know, in you sharing that story, that made me think a little bit about, again, the unique challenges of these kinds of activating events, these ways in which we experience grief, you know, via non-death loss, is our already poor grief support culture, the one that uses phrases like "at least," you know, like just don't start a sentence ever with "at least." Okay, just
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
newsflash, everybody. Right. That we do that with a death loss, right? Again, and
Yes.
listeners will know, someone said to me, at least he'll be in a better place soon as I'm taking my husband off life support.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
No, sir. No,
Yeah.
sir.
Uh-uh.
Right. And I can imagine, I don't know if you've experienced this. I'm sure I've been guilty of this myself, but I think for a lot of people who have folks with addiction, you know, family members with addiction or Alzheimer's, or in your case, right,
Mm-hmm.
or betrayal stories, people's, not only is there no ritual or funeral or something,
Yep.
people don't even want to acknowledge that you're losing something. They want to get to the, well, at least you're better off knowing, or at least blah, 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 or, you know, you had these many years, or there's just this denial of, or they're still alive, so there's still hope. And while, again, we can trade an external hope for a little while, not being able to say, yeah, but I lost this love, or this dream I had about a healthy child, or this
Mm-hmm.
connection I
Mm-hmm.
had with my partner who literally can't connect me with me in the ways that they could because of dementia. It's,
Yeah.
we want to have that both and. In this particular way, this ritual that you were just talking about allows you to say those all things can be true, and I
Yes.
need to acknowledge and honor and begin to metabolize this loss, and to do that through ritual.
Yes. Absolutely. And we, what you describe is what I call the grief cooties. We don't know what to say. We
Yeah.
don't want that. Sorry
Yes.
for you, Lisa. Sorry for you,
Yeah.
Steph, but no thanks, but no thanks.
No.
And, you can tell the difference between, after the shock wears off, after the grief, when the grief subsides a bit, you might be able to then recognize people who are asking because they care about the details,
Yeah.
because they care about you,
Yeah.
or because they're wanting the scoop, like the inside scoop.
Yes.
And I think I like to think that in our grief illiterate society, we're getting a little bit better, but long way to go. We don't know what to say, and that's part of why people like me don't talk about it right away. And if somebody has died a physical death, what I've also learned, because somebody had reached out and shared this with me, was that they don't share the details of their loved one's death because of the shame and embarrassment around it,
Mm.
because somehow that minimizes the pain. So if
Yeah.
somebody has died by suicide, if somebody has died by overdose, or some other way that society so deems unacceptable,
Yeah.
judgy, then the grievers have less right to grieve. They feel
Yes.
less, they should feel less support. Absolutely not. And so, yes, to be able to stand in and tell our story is important, but we also, as a component of that, have to learn how to listen
Yeah.
to others. And when, what I say is, if you don't know what to say,
Yeah.
and for a lot of us, that's the case, right? Because we don't learn about this growing up.
Yeah.
If you don't know what to say, if you feel overwhelmed, prepare yourself and say, thank you for telling me. I'm so glad you told me.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
nothing else,
Exactly.
you can't fix it. Don't try.
Yeah.
You
Oh no.
can't change it. You can't. And again, back to control. Damn it. We can't control this. You can't change it. All we can do is validate and show up.
Yeah.
Thank you for telling me. I'm so glad you told me.
Yeah. That honoring space is so important.
Yeah.
You know, you were just, as you were just sharing the kind of the various scenarios and thinking about the ways in which we experience ambiguous grief, or the ways in which we are often disenfranchised from claiming our grief, as you were just saying, in those
Mm-hmm.
scenarios where maybe somebody died by suicide, or somebody died something that is socially stigmatized, somebody died of overdose. And so it's not that they're not honoring the fact that you lost someone to death, but we don't really get to engage in the social contract of feeling seen and held to the degree that we are, again, in our culture because of this story. And so the more
Mm-hmm.
we as grief supporters can make space for people to feel safe to share those details if they want, or to be able to proactively even acknowledge. I can imagine that sometimes it feels uncomfortable to talk about this because of our social stigma. And I just want you to know that I'm here for it. I recognize your loss. I honor you. Like, how powerful would that be?
Oh, I mean, I'm emotional just hearing you say that because, that's, uh, oh, that would have just been a game changer for
Yeah.
me then,
Yeah.
and again, really, I have wonderful, loving people in my life. They
But
did
how
nothing
could they have known
wrong.
any
They
better?
don't
Because
know, right?
none of us
And
do.
I wasn't really disclosing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when I did, they're grieving too,
Yeah.
right? And so, yeah, we don't know what to say. So oftentimes we say nothing.
Yeah.
We say
Which
the
is saying
wrong thing,
something. Saying
or we
nothing
say
is saying
nothing, which is
something,
saying
by the way.
something.
Saying
Preach.
nothing is saying something. So yeah, maybe just an invitation. I hope that emotionality felt like a good emotionality.
Oh,
And
it
if
did.
for each of you
Yes.
listening, if that felt like it resonated for you, I just want to offer for all of us, because I imagine all of us have someone in our life who's experienced some kind of either disenfranchised grief, so
Mhm.
disenfranchised loss, or ambiguous loss. Um, you know, besides saying the nice words or the kind words, maybe even be brave enough to instigate, maybe be brave enough to say, I can imagine you might be having a hard time finding safe spaces to be able to tell your story. And I just want you to know I'm one of those
Yeah.
spaces whenever you're ready, if you're ready, whenever you're ready, to be really
Mhm.
proactive. What a powerful transformation. And by the way, when you do that, you're not just gifting a gift to that person, you're enacting a kind of ritual or a way of being in the world that will then elicit that person to be able to do that for somebody else, or maybe for you when it's your turn. Because back to my unfun statistic, 100% of us will be in that place. We're both griever and grief supporter many, many, many times in our lives.
Mhm.
So when we can enact and act in ways as grief supporter that nurtures
Yeah.
seeing and knowing, it's a gift all the way around.
It is. And, grief is a gift. I can't even believe I hear myself say
I
this
know. I know.
because it is so not my early belief, right?
Yeah.
It was the mangy house guest that wouldn't leave.
Yeah.
And, I've come to believe that through my own experience and then just so many stories that have been honored to have been shared with me, it's a portal to
Yeah.
our better understanding, to our greatest and highest selves, if we allow it,
If we
right?
allow
But
it.
it's so uncomfortable. I totally understand why some people reject it, close the door.
Yeah.
But it is a unique human experience. It is love's invoice.
Yeah.
Your husband isn't grieving you.
Yeah.
You got stuck with that bill, right? You're picking up the tab, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it sucks. And it is also an honor in
It
some
is
way
it's an
to,
honor. And we see, if, I guess you said, if you're willing to get through the muck and be with the metabolizing, you are, I feel, awakened to the realization that we are all deeply enmeshed and deeply entangled in what all, I mean, beings, planet, earth, people, etc. Awe, joy, wonder, my capacity. Like, these are all the things that grief can move us in profound ways. And to your point, it's the both and how we started probably early in our conversation by saying, and when we aren't able to be with it, not because, by the way, it's a personal moral failing, but because how would we have known how to do it? Because the systems in
yes,
our world don't support it. And when we collectively and individually don't, the flip side of not being with our grief, because it's there whether we acknowledge it or not, can be really harmful. That's where I feel a lot of anger and violence and othering happens, because we haven't come to grips.
that's right.
So I appreciate that. And just to circle back to the invitation, that when we are find these rituals, these communities, the supports, ways in which we can be with our grief, there's transformation that happens. There isn't, by the way, going back to like, and we're all better, or we were who we were before. You and I were chatting a little bit earlier, and you speak in towards the end of your book about this notion of recovery. And I told you sometimes that word gets my hackles all up. I mean, if you're watching on video, I have no hair left post chemo. Well, it's coming back. So
Yeah.
there's not that many hackles. But anyways, the word recovery gets my hackles up a little bit because I think there's that myth of like getting back to. But you use the word regeneration in your book when you were thinking about how we move
Yeah.
forward with our grief and the kind of transmutation or the metabolizing that we do. What does regeneration mean for you? How do you think about that when you think about ambiguous grief?
Yeah, well, this was something that, early on, as I said, I was trying to kind of intellectualize this and using quantitative and qualitative analysis to see if I could, figure it out. Um, it was interesting to find, the things that I did, and it's it it what the outcome looked like at the time.
Yeah.
Early on, again, this would have been, the year after. Um, it was recovery. And recovery is the language that is used
Yeah.
in a lot of different circles. So as I was learning about grief, as I was reading everything I could at the time, as I was really just looking for somebody. I was really looking for the book I wrote. I was looking for somebody to kind of be like, oh yeah, I went through this, and here you go. Here's how you go through the grieving process, right?
Yeah.
Of when your grief is ambiguous, here's the process for healing to feel better. And I didn't find it. But what the data was showing me was that, everything was pointing to recovery. It's like getting to this golden age of recovery. And in recovery, I don't quite know what it looks like, but people are living there. And the best, next best example I could find were people in alcohol or substance or behavior abuse recovery, right? Where
Yeah.
they were learning to live without that substance or behavior addiction.
Yeah.
And did a lot of work to get there. So I co-authored the ambiguous grief process model based on this data, and recovery was kind of the end point, right? But as I continued to go through the experience myself, I too took umbrage with the term recovery. And and I'm like, well, this really isn't the best word. Like, who thought of this? Again, somebody named
Yeah.
it once upon a
Yeah.
time. And then as I was writing the book, I went to my editor and I said, I know that my data for the process model
Yeah.
ends with recovery, but I don't think it does. I don't even like the word now. I can't stand it, and I want to change it. And she's like, well, we don't want to bait and switch the
Yeah.
readers here, right? That
Yeah.
doesn't feel. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that either, but I do want to offer something new that has,
Yeah.
like, you write the
Yeah.
book and then you go, wait a minute,
I
you
already
learned through
mine
it. Yes.
I'm already like, oh, I wish I would have,
Yeah.
yeah.
And, we've been talking about how grief is a portal if we allow it,
Yeah.
how grief can transform us, can change us, and in a basic way, and like the most basic way, the most important way perhaps, is with more compassion, allowing us to just be more compassionate human beings, right? And, to prevent it from coming out sideways somewhere else down the
Yeah.
road through anger or violence or whatnot, right? So, as I was writing, I thought, the etymology of the word recover is, I also take umbrage with. I don't want to recover, which is derived from the French couvert, which is to cover so as to not return, to cover so as to hide. I
Yeah.
don't want to hide this. That's part of the
Yeah.
problem, is we're
Yeah.
covering
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
I don't want to recover.
Yeah.
What do I want? And then I found the word regenerate.
I
And
love
that
that.
is what I Googled what I wanted, and the word regenerate was close. And it is to be born again
Yeah.
at a higher or more spiritual level.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's what this is.
Yeah.
That's what this is. I think we do get to a place we can call recovery. And in my mind, I see it as like Dorothy landing at Oz. Like,
Yeah.
she finally gets to the
Yeah.
Emerald City. And then also she's like, wait, what? This isn't
Yeah.
quite what I expected. But so, yeah, to regenerate is to be born again in a better state, a greater, higher state for our
Yeah.
spiritual selves.
Yeah.
And again, darn it, that we can only regenerate from loss,
Yeah.
right? From pain, from anguish.
Yeah.
But there's beauty in that to be found.
There's beauty in that to be found too. And I would I don't want to speak for you, but I would imagine even regeneration isn't also like anything else, a place we get to and we're done. Like part of our work in this time we have here in these bodies is this cycle, right? Of
Uh-huh.
loving and losing and regenerating, metabolizing and regenerating and loving. And even within our one loss, we're fluid. We're not in the, of course, the stages model is a myth. We're
Hmm.
not moving through that. And so
Right.
if you're hearing this some way where you feel maybe you haven't had a taste of what it feels like to be in that regeneration phase, or you've been there, but you feel like you might be slipping back, just to remember, you know, that we're much more, it's all really a continuum. I had a guest on, I think it was last
Oh,
season, Cecily Sarasky, talked about this. I think the episode was called Discovering Aliveness. Go check it out. It was such a beautiful
yes.
conversation. Her child died and accidentally ingesting fentanyl,
Oh.
and a senior in high school. And she, and I don't want to butcher it, so go
Mm.
back and listen to this episode. But to this point is she talked about, it's not like happiness and sadness. That's not our goal in life, that we are living on this continuum from numbness to aliveness.
Yeah, so it's beautiful. And aliveness includes sorrow and
Sorrow,
pain
right?
and all of it, and
Exactly.
joy and
Exactly.
happiness.
And
Yeah,
part of what our
absolutely.
tendency is to be in the numbness, which by the way, also neurobiologically protective factor. Like we're in denial and numbness. We need that too, because we can't take it all in all at once. So I'm not even like,
Yes.
again, even when we do these like continuums, we want to be like good, bad. I think like numbness has its place, but too
Yeah.
often when we're too aren't equipped and supported in our communities and our culture
Hmm.
to move out of numbness, we miss aliveness. And to your point, aliveness is joy and wonder and awe and heartbreak, because we only can experience those things when we love something,
Yes.
when we care for something. So regeneration, for those of you who are listening, depending on where you are, in this particular season of your life, is how I would think about it.
Yeah.
It might not feel there yet, but just recognize that we're in this continuum. We're in this continuum moving towards aliveness. And that's how
Yes.
I
And
think about regeneration. Yeah.
oh, I love that, Lisa. And it's integrating your grief. And
Yeah.
during the period of regeneration, you're integrating your grief into life as it is, into
Yeah.
the reality, and
Yeah.
which means some days are really hard, even
Yeah.
still, and
Yep.
some days are not. And it's just because it's a continuum, and something that I didn't realize in coaching people one on one through ambiguous grief experiences is that there is overwhelmingly a consistent surprise that grief does not heal. Grief is not healed at the end of our 8 week session,
Yes.
right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, so we have 8 weeks. I'm not healed from this. I'm no,
Yeah.
ma'am. I'm sorry. No,
Yeah.
let's talk about this. It is how it's repackaging it. It's reshaping our grief by getting it out
Yeah.
and touching it and holding it and really looking at it for the
Yeah.
first time,
Yeah.
in many instances. But to say we're healing from grief is something that has been an evolution in myself as well, as I've allowed
Yeah.
myself to have the experience of it.
Yeah.
Is, oh, just like love,
Yeah.
grief never really goes away.
No. I
And
think I think we're healing
why would
with
we want it
grief,
to?
not from
Yes,
grief. I think
yes,
we're
yeah,
healing with grief. Yeah.
absolutely. And my argument, has become, why would we want it to? Why would we
Yeah.
want it to go away? Because it is a part of love.
Yeah.
It's an
Yes.
aspect of love, and it's a beautiful part of our human condition, even though it's so hard.
Even though it sucks sometimes. Yeah.
Sucks. Yeah.
Sucks sometimes. I love that. As we close our conversation today, sort of this reminder, this continuum, this regeneration, this healing with grief, this notion is that this life, this one life that we get, if we believe in that, or this particular life we're in right now, let's just
Mm-hmm.
say that in case you believe in multiple lives, is about the ing, not the ed. We're in
Mm,
it.
yes.
We're ing everything. It's the ing, not the ed. And
Yes.
if we can keep being present to the gifts that come with the ing and not hurry our way or try to trick ourselves into getting to the ed, to the past tense, what a gift. There's so much richness in that.
Yes. And whether it is a grief that is being experienced in an ambiguous way because your person is still alive, or because you have lost somebody to a physical death and you don't know how you can live without them,
Yeah.
you do have a choice in the ing. That's
Yeah.
a choice that is yours. You
Yeah.
can choose to be present and living
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
aliveness. And
There,
we don't have a lot of choices for how we lose our people, but we can choose the ing. Thank you for that, Lisa. That's a beautiful sentiment.
yeah, that resonates back to, or sort of calls back to, the internal hope, that you talk so beautifully about in the book.
Yeah.
Steph, because we've had so many conversations off the air, we could keep going, but I want to make sure that I tell my listeners to check out the link in the show notes for Soulbroken. Get it for yourself, get it for a friend. You can tell everybody how they find your website if you want to participate in the
Oh,
study. It sounds like you're still collecting data.
I
Yeah.
would, that would be great. I would be most grateful. StephanieSarazin.com, StephanieSarazin.com. And the Hope Survey is in the upper right-hand corner. You can find Soulbroken, your guidebook for ambiguous grief, anywhere books are sold. And I hope you find a nugget in there that is helpful to you and your heart.
I'm 100% confident that people will. Thank you so much, Steph, for joining me on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch today. This was truly, truly a pleasure.
Lisa, thanks for having me. And even more, thank you for the work you're doing in this space, because you're making a true difference. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be in conversation with you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Kiefhofer. And don't forget, if you love the show, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. Share something that you learned from our conversation today.